you want a manager who supports you in what you're doing, tells you what you're doing well, helps you become better at the things you're good at? Or do you want a manager who tears you down and nitpicks and pulls apart all the things you do, is constantly critical, and is constantly telling you that you are terrible? Let me put it a different way. Do you want a manager who is constantly telling you you're amazing, gives you lots of positive reinforcement? Or do you want a manager who helps you fix the things that you are failing at, points out the things that you could do better, and helps you become a better employee? Trick question. You want something in between. You need a manager who both tells you when you are doing things well and tells you when you need to get better at things. If you don't have this breadth of feedback, it can be difficult to improve in your position. Much as I am on record as hating the 2x2, I'm going to use a 2x2 in this discussion with these two axes. One going from positive to negative, the degree to which the feedback is focusing on the good things you are doing versus focusing on the bad things you are doing. And then the other, we're just going to call useless to useful. How applicable, how actionable, how much is the feedback you're getting actually something that's going to help you do a better job? I think there is an argument to be made that you could unwind this 2x2 into just a line, because one thing you will notice in a lot of cases is as you get to the extremes of positive or negative, this is often when and where the feedback starts to fall apart. As I become overly negative, it starts to become more and more useless. As I become overly positive, it becomes this snow job of just giving nothing but praise. I think there's an argument there. I don't think it's super accurate, but I think there is an argument. But for today, we're going to do it as a 2x2 because it lets us have a couple of interesting discussions. In a perfect world, you would ideally be getting feedback that rides along the top of this 2x2, where it is incredibly useful and it moves between positive and negative as is applicable. If I'm doing a great job, I'm getting feedback that's showing me what I'm doing great and helps me do more of that. If I'm making mistakes, I'm getting feedback that's pointing those mistakes out and helping me to fix them so I can do things better. What's interesting is the difference between that ideal feedback and what I would say is some of the worst feedback, the very abusive style of feedback, is in the usefulness of the feedback. Some of the most toxic management you can get are people who provide a bunch of essentially useless praise all the time. You guys are great, you're doing amazing, not really actionable, and then they flip on a dime and suddenly they're telling you that you suck and that you're terrible at your job. And on a surface level, that can look a lot like that ideal feedback because it is both negative and positive. But the difference is it's not actionable. And as a result, the dangerous thing is if you have managers of managers or you have HR who are monitoring this situation, these incredibly damaging people who are acting almost like abusive partners can go unmanaged for a long time because if you don't pay enough attention, it kind of looks like they're doing what you want. If we look at the four corners as if they are extremes of people, in the bottom right, I guess, you have people who are incredibly negative and their feedback is basically useless. Most organizations are going to find these people out because everyone hates them. And when they dig in a little bit, they realize that the feedback they are giving is essentially useless. While they might go a little while, usually they're going to get removed from an organization. Going counterclockwise, people who are negative, but their feedback is more actionable, can sometimes last in an organization for a relatively long time because they are often seen as tough but fair, or doing what needs to be done, or being unfiltered. And often organizations feel like they need people like that. The reality is if all you're doing is giving negative feedback, then you aren't building people up. You're just tearing them down. And you need to have a balance. So eventually, People that are like that either rise high enough in an organization that they're essentially untouchable, or they will eventually be removed. If someone gives actionable feedback, but it's only ever positive, it's only ever about things that people are doing well, again, that can work for a while because you're able to strengthen your strengths. But what you can find over time is that the organization starts to develop these almost rotten areas, places where negative feedback was needed, where action was needed to be taken, and that feedback was never given. Now, if you compare these two highly useful but with extremely different styles together, you can sometimes end up with something that works as well as a single person who is bridging that entire gap. It's the good cop, bad cop situation. And then down in the bottom left is the person who gives nothing but positive but essentially useless feedback. If their job is to give feedback, they're not really doing their job. They can remain hidden in an organization for a relatively long period of time because everyone kind of likes them. They tell them they're doing great, but nothing they're doing is actually improving the situation at an organization. You don't want to only be able to give one kind of feedback. You don't want to only be getting one kind of feedback. You want to be moving around within this space in order to correct the things that need to be corrected, but also reinforce the things that need that as well. If you lean more towards corrective feedback, it's worth remembering that if you don't tell people that they're doing something well, they may assume that they're not, and they may change behaviors that you don't want them to. On the other hand, if you don't want to hurt people's feelings because you love giving only positive feedback, consider that if you don't help them fix the things that they're failing at, eventually they're going to be fired. And I'm pretty sure they're going to be more upset about that than you having a slightly harder conversation with them. How have I done historically? My self-assessment is that I do better at the negative, more corrective feedback, making it more positive. And when I've worked for decades at giving more positive feedback, but I think it is probably true that the usefulness of that feedback is less than when I'm giving more constructive feedback. So I'm kind of a diagonal line, somewhere around the middle, hopefully mostly above the useful line. We'll talk about how to give good feedback, useful feedback in the future, but this is a useful lens through which to look at an organization and to look at the people whose job, or at least part of their job, is to provide feedback through this lens, to think about, is this person actually a good leader, or is it just that their team really likes them because they're nice? Is this person actually a good leader, or is it just that they're an a-hole? And depending on your personal preferences, depending on your organizational culture, you may reward people who don't give good feedback because they give something that looks like what you think good feedback looks like. I'm someone who doesn't look for a ton of feedback from my leaders, and sometimes can even reject positive feedback to some degree, especially if I feel like it's not well-founded. As a result, when I'm leading leaders, that can also be something that I can have a bit of a blind spot towards. I don't always give the best positive feedback because it's not something that I'm looking for. But it also means that people who do a lot of management entirely through positive feedback can sometimes look to me like maybe they're not doing the best job. So be aware of your own blind spots as much as you can. That helps you have a more well-rounded organization. It will help you broaden out that feedback cloud and also hopefully push it up into more and more useful territory. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. If you're more comfortable with Patreon, we also have a Patreon which supports the channel. If you're interested in picking up merch, that will be tagged in the video as well. I don't want to necessarily open my comments up to everyone's feedback horror stories, but what are some ways that you've seen where feedback has been given effectively? Or what are some tricks you use to remind yourself to give the feedback in the quadrants that you're not super comfortable with? Maybe let's try to keep the comments in that territory this time. I will see you again soon. Thank you.